5 interesting stuff. Number 5. The Cinereous Mourner. While your adult looks like any generic bird, their babies are a beautiful shade of orange. It helps to blend in with their surroundings of the leaf litter. But even further than that, when they sense a predator nearby, they instinctively move in this bizarre nature. Bizarre until you realize they're mimicking a type of poisonous caterpillar that everyone in the jungle knows to leave alone. The Megalopygidae, sometimes called the fire caterpillar or the pus caterpillar. Nobody's gonna put that in their mouth. If you eat it, you die. So they're staying safe in an odd but effective way. What's even more interesting, but is unrelated to this caterpillar, the shape and color of this caterpillar mimics a feather. Everybody wants to be the other guy. Number 4. The top of a beluga whale's head is actually squishy. They use this pliable bubble of fat to alter the pitch of their echolocation. So this pocket of fat for them is their version of our tongue. Just something squishy to move around and help in communication. Number 3. The oldest known bird in the wild. While usually living anywhere from 12 to 40 years, this licensed albatross is actually 70 years old. Over her lifetime, she's had over 40 babies, and this is her latest addition. The oldest bird to ever live is thought to be Cocky Bennett, who passed away in 1916 at the ripe old age of 120. And Cocky definitely looked 120 years old, even though this was in his younger years at 115 and 116 years of age. Number 2. I don't know. I just thought it was important you see this octopus running away on 2 tentacles to get away from a diver. So, yeah. And number 1. This is the rarest animal on planet Earth, the vaquita. They live in the Gulf of California, and there are about 6 to 22 alive on planet Earth. The rough estimate is around 10, and it's actually the smallest cetacean in the world as well. Sadly, their numbers have been continuously dropping. In 1997, there were over 500. In 2007, there was only 150. And today, if you see one, consider that a once-in-a-lifetime event, one that people of the future won't have an opportunity to experience. The Woodtip Killer. Hella Craft was your average American. Being from Denmark, she decided to move to the USA and called Connecticut home in 1979. She had worked as a flight attendant and enjoyed her job, and it's actually where she met her husband, Richard Craft, who had been working as a pilot at the time. But weirdly enough, he had another job. Despite bringing home almost $400,000 a year, adjusting for inflation, he worked part-time as a police officer, a job he seemingly preferred over being a pilot. So much in fact, he was known for working off the clock, showing up to calls he wasn't even asked to come by. Despite 2 jobs and a bountiful amount of wealth, Richard almost never touched his money. He wouldn't buy a single thing for Hella, and also would only buy basic necessities for the kids. And that's why Hella Craft was still working, to provide nearly every expense on her flight attendant salary. But she loved him, and she overlooked this hurdle. Despite Richard being physically abusive, when he was diagnosed with colon cancer with only a 2% chance to survive, Hella took care of him in his bedridden state. From the chemo and eventual surgery, he, with the help of Hella, overcame his odds of cancer, and the cancer went into remission. Through all this unconditional love that Hella had shown Richard, you would think he would show some back, but that was sadly not the case. He actually didn't love her at all, and claimed to only marry her because she had his child. With that, he had been cheating on her since the beginning of the marriage. After hiring a private investigator, Hella had learned the truth about Richard cheating, with photo evidence of him in multiple affairs. In the month of September in 1986, Hella decided she had enough, and met with a divorce attorney. A couple months later, on November 18th, she told her work friends about the divorce plans, and what she would do to stay afloat, along with other concerns of staying away from Richard afterwards, as she knew his rage would get the best of him. When she got home that night, she confronted Richard and discussed what would happen. And the next day, on the morning of the 19th, their kids remember being woke up because of a power outage, and Richard took them all to his sister's house. Weirdly, Hella didn't join them. Neither did she make it to work her next day, where her workmates got pretty suspicious after the talk that they just had. After 2 weeks of her being missing, and Richard not alerting the authorities, they investigated to find Hella. The investigation found that he bought a chainsaw and a freezer, but Richard would not admit to it. But it doesn't stop there, because investigators went on to find a receipt that tested that Richard had rented a U-Haul and a high-powered wood chipper. One today that would cost $700, a purchase someone wouldn't easily forget. At the scene of where someone saw Richard with the wood chipper, under some recently laid chips, investigators found bone fragments, clumps of hair, teeth, and a human thumb. The teeth were confirmed to be Hella's. And it turns out, the night that Hella confronted Richard, he went mad, beat her in the head with a metal flashlight, froze her body in his freezer, took her frozen body to the woods, cut her body into pieces with a chainsaw, and then threw those pieces into a wood chipper. Even though he claimed to be innocent, in January of 1990, he was sentenced to 50 years in prison. But it doesn't end there, because just last year, he was released from prison on good behavior, and now roams a free man. Nearly 85, never once confessed to his crime. Native American cryptids, the Windigo. First witnessed by the Algonquian people, tribes such as the Wampanoag, Pequot, Cree, Ojibwa, and pretty much any tribe that touches these boundaries. The similarities in culture and language made it easier, not just for physical trade, but also the trade of stories. And though there were similarities, each people had their own suspicion on where this creature had came from. The Windigo is thought to be of spiritual nature, but obviously holds a physical form, and its most common origin story comes from a once normal human being that was overcome with greed and hunger, that they resorted to eating people, in turn catching a sort of disease that would from then on make them have an insatiable desire to eat more human flesh. So something kind of like rabies, except for the physical depiction obviously. who's usually seen with antlers, but also sometimes depicted with a deer-like head, though your other senses will know what's coming before your eyes. As it said, they have the stench of rotting flesh. Pair that with the sudden chill you get, and you could be devouring a human in 3 to 4 business days. It's said that nobody's ever escaped the Windigo as a target either, as this yearn for human is so strong, it never stops until it reaches you. But what it does when it reaches you has always been translated sort of differently. Since there's no such thing as an escape in this event, it's hard to convey the description through a witness. But as it was once a human, now overcome with one goal, and that goal was to eat more human flesh, it's suspected most of the time you're just eating on the spot. But it's also said that its presence can invoke strong emotions in people, and not good ones either. In its presence being the irresistible urge to commit murder, namely referred to as Windigo psychosis. That's not to say these people aren't also eating their victims though, because they are. But whether it turns you into a Windigo as well, or just gives you the same primal urges is still up for debate. As of today, the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual refers to this as a disease and culture syndrome, with a combination of psychiatric and somatic symptoms, meaning it's not voluntary and it's not fake. But in most cases, you'll need to know of the Windigo for it to hurt you in any meaningful manner. It's similar to the nature of the dancing plague in 1518 that killed up to 400 people. To know of it is to subject yourself to its desire. And I bet it's safe to say now, you know of the Windigo. Time out. Commercial break. Only 7% of you guys are subscribed. Help me change that. 92.4 of you guys subscribe right now while you're watching the video. That way you never miss one of these. Joseph Mengele, born March 16, 1911, in Günzburg, Germany. He's more well known as the Angel of Death, and he eventually grew to earn a PhD in 1935 in physical anthropology, which is the study of biological and behavioral aspects of humans. He always had a curious and somewhat dark speculation to the extent of what the human body and mind could be pulled to. In 1938, he joined the SS and the Nazi Party, as well as earning his medical degree. 1943 is when he received his well-known promotion, which got him transferred to the Auschwitz death camp. And while it wasn't the highest rank like people once believed, he was still the one with the most morbid experiments. As one of 30 physicians, a duty was to decide on selections, the job description being waiting for loads of people to arrive and decide who would work in the camp and who were sent to death immediately. But what Joseph did, unlike the others, was show up on his days off in his special pursuit to locate as many twins as possible. He had actually been experimenting on twins since the 30s, but at his new position, his license allowed any disembowelment, lethal substances, and pretty much anything up to death. And while free range with twin children was his favorite area of research, he also had an interest in heterochromia, in chase of altering humans into the blue-eyed perfection the Nazi Party idolized, usually ripping the eyes to be experimented on, but sometimes they stayed in and he injected them with an array of substances. He's thought to have experimented on 1,500 sets of twins while at Auschwitz. The perks of these twins included separate living quarters, additional rations of food, medical care, and being exempt from the gas chamber. But in exchange, they were subject to any type of sick and inhumane experiment Joseph had thought of that day. Experiments that included, but are not limited to, injecting one twin with an unknown substance while the other one was measured for effects, infecting them with typhus, amputating their limbs to see how the other one would react, transfusing blood from one to another, keeping them awake for days on end, and starvation until death. Sadly, no pain medication was used on the patients. They were awake and aware, and they usually died as a result from the experiment. Another doctor visited for a day and witnessed him kill 14 twins that day by injecting chloroform into their hearts. If your twin died, you were killed immediately to compare results of the experiments. He also experimented on people with dwarfism and anyone with physical abnormalities, extracting teeth, transfusing blood, injecting random substances, and a whole lot of x-rays. His favorite hobby was discovering why people of Jewish descent and Romani gypsies were lesser life forms. One notable experiment included sewing 2 gypsies together, trying to create his own set of conjoined twins. Obviously, it didn't work, and the kids were in an immense amount of pain until their eventual passing 7 days after the operation. While phenol was used nearly daily by Joseph, and it is an anesthetic, his only use for it in the camp was as an execution method. He found it best because the lethal amount injected straight into the heart was near instant death. While he's known for his soft touch and quiet demeanor, there is no extent to where his sickening experiments was off limits. Like when the baby was born and he wrapped a mother's chest up so the baby would be unable to feed, to see how long a baby could survive without food. When Auschwitz was invaded, he fled to another camp until it too was saved, and while on the run the second time, he was caught by Soviet forces and put into the US custody. The US supposedly didn't know who he was and released him. He lived in Germany up until 1949 with fake identification. Then his wealthy family bought him his immigration to South America. He moved from Argentina to Paraguay and then to Brazil, where he lived out the rest of his life, only dying in 1979 when he had a stroke on vacation and drowned. After that, he was buried but then dug up and identified in 1992, so he sadly lived a happily ever after life, despite being one of the worst humans to ever exist. 3 things you didn't want to know. Number 3. Plumbers have a busiest day of the year. It lies the day after Thanksgiving, and is called Brown Friday. If you have no idea what that means, on Thanksgiving Day, people engorge themselves after starving themselves all day, and accidentally clog their drains. Luckily, it's not always a toilet though, because people overstuffing their garbage disposal is also half the reason. It's just notorious as brown, because nobody wants to be the one that fixed a clogged toilet after everyone in their extended family used it. Number 2. Who is the smartest serial killer? Well, seeing as not getting caught is part of where the smarts play in, none of the people who have been identified actually qualify as the smartest, because people who are good at killing get caught. but people who are good at killing and smart enough to get away with it won't be identified. The solved murder rate is 69% in the US, but if you want the highest chance of having your murderer captured, live in North Dakota. It's a state with the best solved rate, at 94%, which makes sense, because it's also in the bottom 5 for population. The less people that are in the state, the less people that can be suspects. Just the county I live in has more people than all of North Dakota, so imagine searching the whole state. Or even, yikes. And number 1, technically, you don't stink. It's the bacteria's fault. Your underarm microbiome is inhabited by Staphylococcus hominin. Their food source just happens to be your sweat, and human sweat is basically odorless, but since they chill in your sweaty bits for more food, when they break down those sweat molecules, it compounds into thioalcohols, which is in fact, heavy on the nose, since thioalcohols tend to smell like meat, onions, and sulfur, depending on what other bacteria you have chilling in your sweaty bits. Also, you can only guarantee that only 1 quart of your farts in a day are actually yours, since that's the average air humans swallow eating and drinking on a daily basis, that don't end up as a burp. And the rest of that toxic odor you've been releasing is the fault of, you guessed it, bacteria farting inside you, causing you to release it, though it is a byproduct of them helping you digest your food. But please, let this stay as an internet fact. I promise you, the people in your life do not want to hear that. Faking a disability to win in the Olympics. Being stripped of an Olympic medal isn't unheard of, as many countries have experienced it, especially Russia, who couldn't help but cheat so much they got banned from the 2021 Olympics. But the Paralympics are also no stranger to cheats, mainly with different versions of performance-enhancing substances tracing their bodies after winning. Oh, and the entire 2016 Russian Paralympics team being banned as well. Philip Craven, the president of the International Paralympic Committee, stated Russia had failed its para-athletes by using them as pawns in order to show global power. Yikes, that's as disgraceful as it gets. Except, it isn't. Enter Spain. At the 2000s Paralympics, the basketball team was competing in the Intellectual Disabilities Tournament. If you don't know how that works, the teams are broken up into groups, and you have to face everyone in your group, and the top spots of each group move on. Like Russia and Portugal in 2000. The 2 other teams to make it out were Spain and Poland. Spain amazingly went undefeated in the first round, then faced Poland in the semifinals, who they destroyed 97-67. In the finals, they met up with Germany, who had only lost a single game by a single point, but they also got destroyed, making Spain the Basketball ID 2000's Paralympics gold medalist. That is until Carlos Rubagorda, a player from the team, came out and said most of the players had not taken the required mental test, the test that verifies no player has an IQ above 75, which is what qualifies them for the entry. It turns out that Carlos wasn't just a basketball player, but was also a journalist who went undercover to investigate this. He exposed the only testing that was done were push-ups and a blood pressure test. In these games, Spain was winning so much, they had to be told to stop scoring so much to make it more convincing. Carlos claimed that out of the 12 members of the Paralympic basketball team, only 2 were actually disabled. After the winning news spread, people that knew these players all over their country claimed to know them as well, but as 100% able individuals. Within a couple of weeks, they were exposed not only to their nation, but to the world, and were stripped of their medals, except for the 2 actual disabled players. And who was to blame for all this? Fernando Martín Vicente, the president of the Spanish Federation of Sports People with IDs, who not only lied about the basketball team's disabilities, but also their track and fields, swimming, and table tennis athletes as well, which gave them 5 more medals through cheating. This scandal was so bad, in 2000, the Intellectual Disability Games were removed and were only continued in 2012. The cheating players went uncharged, and Fernando was ordered a fine of like $5,000. So yeah, in my opinion, they got off pretty easy. What did kids used to do? The average schedule today is a 7-hour job, learning starting around age 5 up to 18, and it's so normal, it's expected. Instead of being in school all day, doing a little bit of homework, and then scrolling until you fall asleep, what were prehistoric kids doing? Well, that question is way too broad, because the time periods of prehistory is 2.5 million years ago to 1200 BC, and different people were doing different things all around the world. But in the Stone Age, up until about 12,000 years ago, kids would usually play all day. Much wasn't really expected from them. They were learning though, in the process of playing. Their playing usually involved mimicking their parents, tending to dolls like children, bashing rocks like their parents did to make tools, and hunting and fishing was so prominent, the children would play with kid-sized tools, and spend their times in rivers, lakes, and oceans, play fishing as well. And those things would actually aid them in their future duties as adults. Lots of humans were still nomadic at this time, so also walking miles and miles some months, but that's the boring stuff, and everyone had to do it to, stay alive. In these times, there was no such thing as a teen. Most communities went from child to adult in a day, via ritual or some kind of special occasion happening. Stone and bone tools that are actually effective are a lot harder to make than people expect, and it takes training and practice, as do many other things for daily life. Paris base in France has a distribution of stone artifacts across certain caves and sites not in their main living area that suggests novice stone tool creation was taking place. Practice rocks, from what we would today consider teens, were fine-tuning their motor skills for a couple hours a day, but as time progressed, real work started happening in some places. From 10,000 to 5,000 years ago, most humans were in settlements, and staying in one place all day was a lot better for kids because it was a lot less walking. but also help things advance, like farming tools, creating potteries, sewing baskets, and so kids mimic those as well. But this is also when kids started participating in not only practicing skills, but also working with them as well. 2 children, possibly up to the age of 9, were found with grooves in their teeth with the same pattern, a pattern that suggests a chewing motion that was used for hours at a time. They were the same grooves that occurred in workers whose jobs were chewing, stretching, and softening animal tendons and basket weaving material, and after that, it was all downhill. The time period following consisted of kids working a lot, and young too. Most kids were breastfed up until about 3 years old, and until 5 they were still seen as babies. 5 and up were developed children, which was now the new working status. Between then and the 1930s, kids did terrible backbreaking work, but luckily, or unluckily if you hate school, most kids were banned from working. They spent a lot more time learning in modern classroom setups. But that could still change. Maybe humans 10,000 years in the future might see 7 hours of schoolwork for 12 years unnecessary or even inhumane. Top 3 common sayings with dark origins. Number 3, calling shotgun. When road trips used to entail horse-drawn carriages, the stagecoach was used for high-value items, or for wealthy people to be transported in. The driver of these would be held in high esteem, and would be at the pinnacle of transportation. While on job, since they usually move sensitive carry-on, they would be accompanied by a passenger, who would sit next to them while carrying a shotgun, and their job was to protect these packages at all time. Number 2, a baker's dozen. Now hold on, because I'm about to explain this punishment by tier and perceived gender. Bread regulation used to be a thing in medieval England, but up until Henry III, it wasn't really watched that closely, so he enacted stronger regulations. People would try and sell low quality bread, or smaller than should be portions, to save money in bread making ingredients. So King Henry enacted an assize that declared any man trying to overcharge their bread for less than 2 sterlings for the first 3 times, they would pay a fine. If you were found exceeding that 3-time limit, or overcharged more than 2 sterling, you would undergo the judgment of the pillory, which is just being put in one of these things. But if you were to exceed this 2 sterling limit more than once, you would suffer judgment of the body, which translates to getting your hands chopped off. But for women, the amounts aren't specified, but their punishments include the trebuchet, which does not sound fun, the cucking stool, which is pretty much just being tied to a chair while they dunk you in the water, and the tumbril, which is just one of these cards. But these were often used to carry victims to their executions. And number 1, to wreak havoc. While it's always meant something negative, to wreak havoc used to be a cry in the battlefield for troops of England. But unlike most, meaning something like change of formation or retreat, the word havoc meant there was no limits on your actions. People would scream the word havoc, which would be followed by murder, rape, destroying all property, and pretty much anything you can think of. And this havoc cry was so heinous, King Richard II had to outlaw it. And anyone who partook in the havoc was beheaded. 5 interesting stuff. Number 5. Have you ever been so mad at something that's broken, you decide to smack it and it magically starts working? Yeah, well that's actually called percussive maintenance. Some people are actually a specialist in this area. Like me, when my Xbox 360 got the red ring of death, I lost all hope and punted it across the room, plugged it back in, and found the value in why God made rage. Number 4. There's actually a record for the fastest bra removal. A man named Sean Murray, not to be confused with the classical composer Sean Murray, or the world-renowned actor Sean Murray. This Sean is even more talented than both. His record stands at being able to undo 91 bras in under 60 seconds. Yeah, it's a weird record, but someone's gotta do it. Number 3. 2 things you would not expect to have any correlation. KFC and Japan. But a manager in a KFC Japan restaurant promoted fried chicken party barrels for Christmas, and it caught on so well, in 1974, KFC Japan started Kentucky Christmas. Since then, it's become a part of the Christmas holiday in Japan. For many, they include fried chicken as their meal. So many, in fact, KFC sold around Christmas Eve account for 5% of the annual revenue. Number 2. High schools used to not be free, as some people claim the US was trying to waste taxpayer dollars, but eventually, the National Education Association got their way, and instead of just rich kids going to high school, from the 1890s to the 1940s, it became standard for everyone. But leaving 8th grade required you to pass an exam. This one came from Kansas. It's also long, so this is just the geography section. Would you have passed this to make it into the 9th grade? And number 1. It was hot and cold until the 80s, when the world started to only get hotter. Reliable temperature tracking came about from 1880 to 1884, and since then, out of the 20th hottest years, 19 of them happened since the year 2000, and the other one was in 1998. And while the world is only 2 degrees hotter, small numbers mean big change. In the last ice age, where the US was covered in 3,000 feet of ice, it was only cooler than today by an average of 8 degrees. At the accelerated rate we're on, the top 1,300 scientists from the panel on climate change suggest a spike in warming up to 10 degrees in the next 100 years, which will cause droughts, which USA is in right now, stronger and more frequent hurricanes, which have been increasing suspiciously since 1980, rising sea levels, which we're already combating, and unpredictable floods, all problems to humans created by humans. But on the bright side, the people who aren't victim to these events will see an increase of growing season, which have also been increasing since the 80s. They'll have a whole extra month, and even up to 8 weeks in some places, of growing their crops, if they aren't affected by droughts or floods or hurricanes. And that's why you always look for the silver lining.